Good morning, everybody. This is Bev Lutkmeyer in the Office of Special Education Compliance Director, is what I do. And so happy to see everybody logging in this morning to this Zoom. It's part two, dedicated to eligibility for specific learning abilities, disabilities. Thanks, Tiffany Smith and Jeannie Rothermel for leading the training on this, and I'm going to go through our norms really quickly. So mute unless you're speaking to the group. That really helps our recording quality because we record and post these later so that they're available for you guys out in school districts to use for PD should you choose. Use the chat to ask questions. Now, today we're going to ask you to hold off putting your questions in until later, because sometimes those questions popping up are distracting to folks, and we really want you to pay attention to the content. You can use a Word document to type your questions and copy paste them into the chat later, or just put them in the chat and don't hit enter yet if that works for you. Tiffany and Jeannie's emails will also be available on the slides, and we'll post them in the chat for you guys as well. And you can email questions directly to them if you don't want to use the chat. So be professional and helpful is our third norm. And just be mindful about personally identifiable information when asking questions about specific scenarios. So without any further delay, I'm going to turn it over to, I believe Jeannie's going to start.
All right. Good morning, everybody. This is just the slide that Bev mentioned that has Tiffany and my email addresses on them. Just as typical, this presentation will be posted on that Director Resources tab. So you can get it, you can download it, you can print it, you can do whatever you want with it. And that should happen pretty quickly. Usually it's by the beginning of that next week, if it's not by the next day. So, and otherwise you can, as Bev mentioned, we'll keep the presentation open a little bit longer so that if you did write down a question that you want to put in the chat, you'll have some time to do that at the end. All right, so last 2 weeks ago, when we talked about specific learning disabilities, we had asked you guys to do that, either send us questions, or there were a couple questions that were put in the chat at the end. And we had said that we would address those during this time frame. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this because this FAQ document is available. It's linked here, plus it's out there on that DESE resources page. So you are more than welcome. Oh, crud, sorry. We're doing this new technology thing and it disappears. So anyway, I'm going to run through these pretty quickly. What is an appropriate threshold to determine excessive absences? There is no number, you guys. There's no guidance here as far as, oh, if it's this, it's a straight cutoff and you're not going to evaluate. This is really up to you guys in your setting, in your system to make that determination. I will tell you that there's pretty much research out there that says, you know, even kids who are there 90% of the time, which means if you're looking at a 180-day school year, if they miss 10% of the time, that's 18 days that they're not at school, that even that can cause some learning problems for various kids. So again, I'm not saying use 90%. I'm saying you guys as a system have to make some kind of a determination about what you're looking at. And we know there are kids who are going to miss a lot of days and it doesn't really affect them. They seem to be okay with their learning. And then there are kids who miss just a couple days and it does seem to have an effect. So that's an individual decision. There's some information there on the Q&A that you can look at. Somebody would like a better form for psych processing deficits than what we've had in the past. Tiffany has a bunch of resources that she put into the Q&A. So I'm just going to direct you to that so that you can look at those resources and see if those would meet your needs. Same thing goes for this next question about observations. We had a myth of the month and some Q&A that addressed all those kinds of things about observations. So please go to that Director Resources tab. Bev, if you can put that, or Bailey, put that in the chat, that would be great. To get to that page. But please consult those things because they do answer that question. Then there was a question about having dyslexia, an outside dyslexia diagnosis, and does that change anything in regard to eligibility? Really, this person answered their own question, or is this just another piece of the puzzle and possibly a reason to suspect a disability? Absolutely, that is the answer. It's a piece to the puzzle. You still have to meet eligibility criteria for the state of Missouri for an SLD eligibility. This is a piece of the puzzle. And yes, probably a reason to suspect a disability, and then you would just let your process take over and see what happens at the end. It's not an automatic eligibility. Just because you're dyslexic doesn't mean you're automatically eligible under IDEA for special education services. All right, so let the process work for you. Does auditory processing fall under SLD? It can, yes. Perceptual disabilities, which is what an auditory processing deficit is, can fall under SLD. But again, the child has to meet the criteria for a specific learning disability in order to be for auditory processing to qualify them as a student with a specific learning disability. It's possible that students with auditory processing issues also qualify under language. I mean, you need to look at the full gamut, but you can't, nowhere can we say, well, auditory processing cannot be, you can't have an auditory processing deficit and qualify. We can't make that kind of a statement. So if there's a reason to suspect a disability, you have this outside diagnosis, take the kids through the process and see, do they qualify in any of those areas? There's also a little bit more information about auditory processing. There's a link on the question and answer form that you can get a little bit more information about. How can actually, these last three questions all have to do with that slow learner issue. And so how do teachers assist kids that are slow learners? In general, you guys, there is nothing that says that just because a child has a lower IQ, they couldn't potentially be SLD if they had that 22 points and all the other criteria were met. There's nothing that says that. However, be very careful about when you look at scores on those achievement tests. Typically, if kids score in that really low range, like in that 50 range, in that even low 60 range on some of those assessments, you need to take a look at, first of all, look at the kid's answers. Is this a kid who just didn't answer? And there's evidence in your system, in what they do in the classroom and those kinds of things to say, well, in fact, they have better skills than what this actually showed up. All right. The other thing you have to be careful about is oftentimes we have people who are not trained giving these assessments and they don't score them correctly, or they don't count answers that should have been counted or count answers that shouldn't have been counted. And so when those kinds of things happen, when you get those really low scores, you need to take a look at how the kid answered, how this test was scored, to see, is that a legitimate number, or did something happen in the middle of all of that does not make that a legitimate number? But all in all, if there is a 22-point discrepancy and all of those other criteria line up, that we do see that absolutely this matches what is happening in the classroom, then there's nothing that prohibits that kid from being found eligible. Keep in mind, though, that typical idea of a student with a specific learning disability is that they have in that average or above range of intellectual ability. How do people assist kids with slow learners? When you do evaluate kids and you find out, oh, well, they're not going to qualify because in fact, that's kind of where there is no real split. There is no real There's no difference there. Their learning profile is pretty much flat across the board. Somebody does have to help those kids. I mean, it's not okay to say, well, you didn't qualify, too bad, you're going to have to function like everybody else. So there are, in the Q&A, there are some, suggestions about a multi-tiered system of support. Literally, kids can stay in a multi-tiered system of support forever. There is nothing that says, oh, you passed this threshold and you can't be in here anymore. If they need to be receiving intervention forever, they receive intervention forever. Practices like Universal Design for Learning help gen ed teachers understand how to plan up front for those kids. And so I would highly suggest that you look at the Universal Design for Learning, some training in that. Also some training in differentiated instruction. And I know people like just cringe when they hear that word, but that's truly what needs to happen in gen ed classrooms for all kids to learn at a rate that's appropriate for them. So there are things that can happen and should be happening. It's not too bad you didn't qualify. Now you're just going to have to struggle. And then the use of professional judgment with those slow learners. Keep in mind, the use of professional judgment is really designed for those kids who are very close to legitimately qualifying, but they're just not quite there. And all the other evidence lines up to say, yep, we see great patterns of strengths and weaknesses here. This weak area was just barely not weak enough. And those are the things. And you have lots and lots and lots of corroborating evidence to say, yes, in fact, this child truly is, having some very, very significant difficulty in this area. And we were going to, kind of override some of that criteria to say that they qualify. It is not supposed to be the use just to say to the criteria, okay, we don't need to think about you. We're just going to use this as a reason to qualify you, even though you aren't close, you don't meet the criteria. That's not the point of professional judgment. And I will tell you, we see a lot of that when we're looking at evaluation reports. These kids have a flat profile, 82 IQ, 80s or high 70s in their achievement scores. Everything else lines up with that's pretty much where the kid's functioning. And then all of a sudden they qualify as SLD. So that is really not what the professional judgment in the area of specific learning disabilities is supposed to be for. Again, here's the link to the Q&A. So we're going to move on. Today, you guys know we're talking about evaluations and assessments. We're going to dig into some of those assessment practices that we see as perhaps people not really understanding or knowing. All right. Today, we're going to talk about some common vocabulary, the purpose of actually doing evaluations, setting the stage for getting these appropriate evaluations, the guiding principles for these assessment practices, and then share with you a couple of action steps for what you might do as a system moving forward to maybe shore up some of the things that you're doing. The assessment myth of the month is actually linked here. Remember, there were two this month, the one on SLD and this one on assessment. So it's linked here. If you haven't had an opportunity to look at it, I highly suggest that you go and download it so you can take a look at it after this presentation. Real quickly, we get a lot, there's a lot of misuse of words sometimes. And I would say, as long as everybody in your system understands the words you're using for the various things that you're doing, I wouldn't get too worked up about it, but we need to make sure that parents understand that when we talk about assessment, this is kind of like this is the stuff that's happening in the middle of this process. This is all of those things. It's not just the actual norm reference tests or some of those scales that we do. It includes our observations. It includes our discussions of what these kids are doing in the regular classroom. Part of assessments is actually looking at classwork, looking at some of your benchmarking data. All of those are part of that assessment process, all right, it's an inquiry-based problem-solving process, and we're looking at all of that information when we talk about assessment. It's going to go too fast. Evaluation in this context is really that entire piece, that entire process. It's going from a review of existing data all the way to an eligibility determination. That when we talk about evaluation in special education, that's what we mean. All right. That in between stuff of gathering all that information is the assessment piece. And we use tests in that overall piece of the assessment. The tests are generally that data collection tool. All right. And usually we think of that as something that comes in a box or something that it's a piece of paper that we fill out or something along that line. Obviously, we sometimes refer to those as assessment measures, assessment instruments. Sometimes we just call them assessments, but making sure that we're all aware of the vocabulary and what we mean when we're talking about those things, and that the other people on our teams also understand those terms is important. Remember, the purpose of evaluation is really twofold. We call it evaluation, it's D squared. Number one, you're looking to determine eligibility. That's important, but actually more important is that evaluation should really be the big piece of how you're making educational decisions for this child. What you're doing from the standpoint of what kind of goals, what kind of information are you putting in that present level? What kinds of goals are coming from that? What kind of services are you actually going to provide to that child? All of that is the big, that's really the information you should be getting from your evaluation, is answers to those kinds of questions. And we put on the, well, in a minute we did. The evaluation is driven by that referral. All right. So you guys know it goes from referral to review of existing data to evaluation. Every piece and part of that is important. Here are some questions that you need to be thinking about in that entire process so that it all connects together. What specific concerns prompted the referral? You may have a parent who makes a referral based on a concern that we don't see as a concern in school. All right. So perhaps at that point, you're making that decision that we don't have a reason to suspect a disability. Okay, you've made that decision. But if you decide that you're taking this on into that review of it, that you do suspect a disability and you're going to move into a review of existing data, is that concern reflected in that review of existing data from other people, from other situations? We don't just evaluate because a parent has a concern if we don't see those same kinds of concerns in our setting. All right. So make sure that that adequately gets described and talked through in that review of existing data. Sometimes additional concerns come up when we actually sit down and have that conversation. Have they been adequately described in your review of existing data? Have you looked at those individual kinds of concerns, those things very specific to that kid, and use that to drive your specific tests or assessment measures that you're going to use? Have we tailored that assessment to the child? I think, unfortunately, what we see maybe too often is that in a system, we've just decided, here's what we do. We're not tailoring it to the child. Everybody gets a Woodcock-Johnson, whether you need it or not. Even if we have no concerns in math, if we have no concerns in written expression, we give the whole thing. And that's it. And that's all we give. We're not looking at, additional information in reading, even though that's the concern. That's just straight up what we give. We need to tailor those assessments, that process to that individual child, and really consider what measures do we need to for that particular kid. You never have to give an entire Woodcock-Johnson, an entire KTEA, an entire Wyatt if there is not a reason to give all of those subtests. You don't need to do it. And I think too often we default to that. And I've heard people say, well, just in case, did it come up as a concern in the review of existing data? If it did not come up as a concern, why are you worried about just in case? If that's your take on it, then that review of existing data meeting did not go as it should have gone. So again, all important in the process. And throughout this entire process, you guys, we are using what we would call clinical and professional judgment in this process. At every stage, you are asked to use your background knowledge and other expertise that you have to make decisions. There is very little that is black and white in this entire process. And so we need to have people who do have knowledge involved in this whole process, so that we aren't just making decisions because that's what we did before. All right. All of this has to do with professional judgment and clinical expertise. When you're preparing, when you're gathering the information, and when you're making decisions, all of those things involve professional judgment in some way, shape, or form. And we kind of get messed up with our thought of professional judgment. So if it's easier to talk about clinical expertise, then use that word, because we do use professional judgment when we're talking about eligibility determinations. But that's what it's about. It's about having some expertise. Hence the reason that we have put together the SLD information and this information today on assessment, because we need people in this process who do have some clinical expertise in order to make decisions about kids, because the decisions we make there are lifelong consequences to these decisions. And so we all know that there is, unfortunately, there's a propensity for lower academic expectations, for lower achievement, and ultimately fewer post-secondary options when we identify kids. We want to think that it's the right thing to do. We got to make sure it's absolutely the right thing to do when we're doing it. And again, that's why we need that clinical expertise on this whole process, so that we do make good decisions. All right, it is Tiffany's turn to take over. So I'm going to take myself off of this little button, so I don't make anything happen. All right.
That's funny, because now my button is disappeared. There we go. Okay. Again, with new technology comes great responsibility, and Jeannie and I are just kind of figuring this all out today. So thank you for your grace and your patience with that. I just wanted to kind of reiterate a few key points before we go on. I've been noticing that we've had a lot of people join in after the Zoom has already started. We are so thankful that you're here joining us. We're so grateful that you're giving us your time for today to join us through this learning opportunity together. But I just kind of wanted to hit some highlights on some of these assessment practices that we're going to be really diving into. It may stir up a lot of questions. It may stir up a lot of reflective questions when you're looking and thinking about your current practices and possibly changes to your practices and different scenarios that may come to mind. We just ask that kind of you reflect on those, and that you either write those down on a sticky note or somewhere, and then save those to the end of our conversation, because sometimes the questions that you may have at the beginning of our time together, at the beginning of the slideshow, may be answered in a couple slides down further in the PowerPoint or the slideshow. So just kind of hold those questions if you can till the end of our time together. We'll leave extra time that you can put those in the chat, or you can email those to us. So that's kind of how we're going to do questions today, because a lot of this information, we'll introduce it at the beginning, and then we'll build upon it later on as we go throughout the slideshow together. So just kind of a note about that. And also just a little disclaimer there, some of these assessment practices can go really, really deep with the information. Just know that the purpose today is just to give a brief overview of some of these terms and some of these practices that we need to be adhering to in order to have ethical administration of our assessments. And if you want further in-depth knowledge about that, look at some of those resources and look at that assessment myth of the month, and then contact one of us and we'll be more than happy to lead you through that. And also, I feel compelled to tell you that I've been kind of watching the clock here, and it's already about 9:25. And we know typically that we run, it's all good. Typically, we run about an hour for each one of these Zooms, but we know that this is a topic here that has so much rich information that it's really hard to kind of speed up some of this information, because then you lose some of the context, and that we just are giving you guys maybe a bonus gift today, because we do feel like we're going to run over that hour timeline. So we will do our best to kind of keep this section underneath an hour here, but we may go up right up until around 10:20 or 10:30 with this information, because again, sometimes if you try to speed up and skip over some of this content, you lose the whole context of it. So just bear with us, and I hope that you guys enjoy this next section, because we're going to be really kind of delving deep into what are those sound assessment practices that we should be adhering to whenever we're performing evaluations and assessments within the educational setting. So I think it's really important, before we delve into kind of what the professional organization would say about those sound testing practices, to really ground our thinking and our philosophies about testing and our principles and our policies that we currently use in IDEA requirements. We need to go back and see what IDEA has to say about evaluations and how they should be conducted, because actually IDEA has a lot of information to say about what the requirements are for conducting what they call a comprehensive evaluation. And I've got the IDEA statute citation at the bottom here, but just know that also in the Missouri State Plan for Special Education, we use the exact same language and the exact same verbiage that appears in IDEA. So this may be something that you want to go back and do a little bit of a self-study on, share this with your staff to make sure that your policies and procedures are actually lining up with what we have in the Missouri State Plan as far as the requirements for evaluations. When you look at the Missouri State Plan and IDEA, there are more bullets and more key items that deal with evaluations than what we have here on this screen. But this is just kind of a brief synopsis of some of those critical components that we look at here. And so again, knowing that this is just a brief overview and not really in the entirety, I would recommend that you go back and look at exactly what all those requirements are in the state plan. But here are the high ones, that the high points that we really want to hit and keep coming back to throughout our presentation today, that we really focus on looking at the totality of the information that we have on this student here, that we really cannot and should not be making determinations on educational programming or educational eligibility determinations based upon a single test measure, a single test score, or pieces of our data that's gathered from one single test tool. So we need to just make sure that we have that broad, comprehensive evaluation that really is going to give us data, so we examine all sorts of information that is relevant to all areas of the suspected disability. And for some of these students, you may be suspecting more than one disability. And so we have to make sure that we're really covering all of our bases there. But again, as Jeannie mentioned earlier, that's going to stem from you doing a very good comprehensive referral and a comprehensive read, which is going to lead to these conversations about selecting tools that we're going to get to here in just a second. But just know that IDEA really calls us to be intentional about our evaluation process, that we need to be looking at that variety of assessment tools, not just relying heavily on those norm reference tests, which we sometimes find out, but expanding our tool collection there and looking at different ways we can collect the data that we need, and making sure that whenever we do purchase assessments and tests, and whenever we do settle on choosing out that we're going to use this tool over another tool that we may have available, that we're making sure that those tools are technically sound and that they're reliable and valid measures of what we're trying to measure. And we'll get into that in a little bit deeper here in just a second. And then lastly, this is the big point that we really want to make sure that everyone fully understands here, that assessments have special qualifications about who can actually be a user of those assessments, who can administer those assessments, who can score those assessments, and who can interpret those assessments. And it's really key to understand that this guidance is set forth by the publishing company, and it's not a DESE mandate. We don't make the rules and qualification levels for the certain assessments. We have to remember that that all goes back to the publisher guidance. What DESE requires us to do is fall in line with what the publisher guidance say. And that's what IDEA requires us to do. They require us to go back and look at making sure that we're following all the test publisher guidance for assessments, making sure that we're conducting them in the manner that they were designed to be conducted, and making sure that we're doing it in a technically sound and valid and reliable way. So we're going to get into each one of those aspects as we go through the rest of the slides today. In addition to IDEA guidance about evaluation, many of your professional organizations that deal with the ethics and the testing and evaluation of students, such as the American Psychological Association, and the American Association of School Counselors, the National Association of School Psychologists, all of those professional types of organizations, plus many others, have composed different guidance documents that exist out there that really give guidance and drive what sound testing practices should be put into place in education when we're giving tests. And when we talk about tests, we're not only just talking about standardized tests as far as a comprehensive evaluation, but these standard practices should really be examined with any sort of test that we're giving in the educational setting, whether it be your criterion reference test that you're using for district benchmark data, or your norm reference test that you're using as far as interventions and screening data. All of these testing practices that we're going to be talking about today and these guiding principles really adhere to all sorts of different testing aspects that take place within the educational setting. But just knowing that these practices and principles that we're going to be talking about have a sound, solid research base behind them, and that all of these standards and guiding principles are backed by the professional organizations who set these particular standards. Okay. And one of the particular guidance documents, the Code for Fair Testing Practices, breaks down testing and assessment in the educational setting into 6 different guiding principles out there. And so when we look at the assessment process and how we test kids in the school setting, we really should be looking at the process from start to finish. And so there are some guiding principles that the Code for Fair Testing Practices has developed on the whole process from start to finish. And so that's kind of what's going to be the framework for when we're looking at what are some acceptable, ethical, appropriate testing practices to sustain within your particular organization. The first one, and Jeannie kind of hit on this earlier, how do we go about even selecting those tools that we're going to be using? How do we select those testing instruments? Again, there's all sorts of different ways that we can conduct an individualized assessment of a child's skill level, behaviors, and social emotional needs, and so on and so forth. And most of those, we rely upon one particular type of tool called the norm reference test. We see a lot of evaluation reports that are very, very heavy in this particular assessment style. And that's okay. Norm reference tests give you some good data, but we have to understand that there are limitations to that particular type of data. And it's not going to tell us everything that we need to know about that kid and where their learning is in comparison to state standards, curriculum measures, and so on and so forth. So we have to kind of make sure that we're branching out and aligning our assessment practices to exactly what IDEA calls us to do. IDEA calls us to use a variety of assessment tools. And so when you're looking at your testing protocols, making sure that we're not giving kids all the same battery of assessments, like Jeannie had mentioned earlier, oftentimes we see that a kid will get a WISC and a Woodcock and a Connors, regardless of what the particular referral concerns may be. So we have to be very conscientious about that. And just remembering too, that besides norm reference tests, there are also different kinds of tests out there. There are criterion reference tests. And these tests, they measure the student's mastery of skills in comparison to a certain curriculum standard or a rubric measurement per se of the mastery of a particular standard or a criteria for success. Whereas norm reference tests, those are going to basically rank the student's performance in comparison to a normed population. So there's different metrics that are being used, and both of those tests have different value and different purposes and telling us how the kid's learning and what they're learning. Also, observations are an extremely powerful tool to collect data. And you'll know that multiple eligibility categories in the state of Missouri require observations to substantiate what we're actually finding on tests is actually happening in the different learning environments. That's because those observations provide us with a critical insight to how the student is actually functioning in those particular educational environments. And so don't forget about your observations. And interviews are another key piece, excuse me, of data that can be collected. You can have parent interviews. In fact, the Vineland, when we look at the Vineland and look at the manual, it actually gives us parent interview forms. And it's actually states that interviewing is one of the best ways to collect that kind of information about a student's adaptive skill functioning from parents. And so don't overlook the power of interviews as well. Again, getting back to that whole thought process that when we're choosing assessment tools, we have to be very thoughtful and intentional about which tools we're choosing to do the job. Because, you know, the old saying is that if all you have is a hammer, everything's going to look like a nail. So we have to make sure that we have a variety of tools to collect the data that we need. And the data that we need has to be directly aligned to those referral questions that come out, those concerns that are brought forth in the referral process, or those concerns that are even brought forth prior to referral and the student assistance teams and so on and so forth. But also, this really brings home the importance of doing an extensive, very thorough RED process, because that's where you're going to lay out all of the data that you already have about the student. And then that's going to drive specifically what tools do we need to collect the data that we don't have in the RED, but we still have questions about. And so looking here at this slide, we'll give you some additional questions to kind of work through with your teams when you're trying to determine which specific tools to select to do the job. Excuse me, pardon me. One thing that we spend a lot of time having discussions with schools about is not to get caught up in the word comprehensive evaluation, which IDEA requires us to. And don't automatically equate that to meaning that we have to give the entire battery of a normed reference test. And Jeannie already hit this point pretty heavily earlier, but it bears repeating that just because a student is referred for reading concerns, if we don't have any concerns in the area of math, or we don't have any concerns in the area of written language, and through our RED process, we already have data that shows that this child has normal or above normal functioning in the area of math and written language, and we don't need any other additional data in those areas to substantiate that, then most likely giving that entire test battery is not necessary to answer the concerns and the inquiries that we still have about the students' lack of reading difficulties, or students' reading difficulties that they're exhibiting. So being very intentional and inquiry driven about which tools to select. So just don't automatically equate that a comprehensive evaluation means giving the entire battery, because it certainly does not. And even when you get into the manuals of your specific tests and assessments, like the Wyatt and the KTEA and the Woodcock, it will talk to you about how to go through selecting which assessments to give, which tests, which subtests. In fact, the KTEA manual has a really nice section that lays out what are the specific referral concerns, and based upon those referral concerns, then these are the subtests that you may need to start with. And then based upon that information that you get, then you can go on to different tests. So again, breaking into those manuals and really knowing about how that can help you drive your selection of tools on your subtests and your tests that you give is very, very helpful. Because what we really want to avoid is that over testing, over assessing a child, because it takes time away from instruction. It takes our time away from doing the other items that are on our to-do list. And it just really is not an efficient use of our resources if we're constantly over assessing students. We do have a video in here that is about 5 minutes long, but it is really hits home the point about why we need to avoid over assessing and how teams can really drill down how they select those appropriate tools. And so I am going to go ahead and play this for you. And please know that Jeannie and I practiced with this morning and it worked perfectly. So let's keep our fingers crossed here. All right, and this video, I should cite here that we are using this video off the Idaho Technical Assistance and Training Clearinghouse. And what they've done is they've made a whole module about effective evaluation practices, and they really hit home on how we can avoid over assessments in this particular video. So I'm going to go ahead and play this now.
Hi, I'm Julie Mead, Director of Idaho SESTA here at Boise State University and Certified School Psychologist. We've talked about putting the time and effort into the referral process in order to be more efficient and accurate in later steps of the evaluation process. We've also talked about the purpose of assessment. In this video, I will talk about overassessment. As you know, there are many types of assessment. For the purpose of this video, when I discuss overassessment, I'm referring to formal, standardized assessments. Your time is valuable. There never seems to be enough time to complete all the tasks on your list, and most of you would rather spend time working directly with students rather than administering assessments or reporting results. Once teams have established referral questions and identified areas where more information is needed to make an eligibility decision, they can begin determining which specific assessments should be administered. At this point, it's important that each assessment be relevant and necessary for completing the last 3 steps of the evaluation process, listed here. The assessments selected should provide relevant evidence for teams to analyze regarding the student's strengths and needs, provide information sufficient for establishing eligibility or ineligibility, and provide meaningful and actionable data for teachers and parents. When teams are intentional about selecting only the assessments needed to answer referral questions and fill gaps of needed but missing information that were identified during the referral process, they become more efficient in the evaluation process and students benefit. When selecting which assessments to administer, consider the relevance of the information to be gathered by the assessment. Sometimes teams administer subtests or even full assessments that are not relevant to the identified area or areas of concern. For example, during the referral process, the team suspected that Tommy may have a specific learning disability in the area of math calculation. The team completes the following assessments: Woodcock-Johnson 4 Cognitive Battery, Classroom Observation during Math Class, Woodcock-Johnson 4 Academic Achievement Battery. While we know that the psychological processing and classroom observation in the area of concern are required components of an SLD evaluation, this team administered the entire battery of achievement assessments when only 2 subtests, enough to generate the math calculation cluster score, were required. Subtests related to reading and written language are not related to the identified areas of concern or the referral question. Those subtests were not relevant for this student. To avoid administering assessments that are unrelated to the referral question or identified areas of concern, ask yourself the following questions. What information will this assessment provide? Will the information gathered help to answer the referral questions? Does the assessment address areas of concern brought forward during the referral process? If the answers to these questions suggest that the assessment does not provide the information needed, it may not be relevant. Let's look at another example. Sometimes teams administer assessments in areas that are not identified as areas of concern, simply as a precaution, or just in case there's something to catch. When teams are thorough in the referral process, this should not be necessary. In Tommy's case, the cognitive battery and appropriate achievement subtests were administered, and a classroom observation was conducted. The team added a Connors rating scale just in case, even though there were no concerns expressed regarding attention or behavior. This assessment is likely not relevant for this student. Before administering an assessment in an area that was not identified as an area of concern, ask yourself these questions. What questions am I seeking to answer? Will this assessment address an area of concern brought forward during the referral process? If not, then are there additional concerns that were not brought forward? Finally, what will we do with the information that is gathered? If the answers to these questions suggest that the assessment is not directly related to identified concerns, it may not be relevant for this student. In addition to relevance, teams should consider whether each assessment being administered is necessary. When all existing evidence is reviewed thoroughly during the referral process, teams should be able to easily identify which areas require new assessments and which areas do not. When presented with a clinical evaluation or a report from a provider outside of the school system, or even from another school district, some teams feel compelled to conduct new assessments to verify or confirm the information received. There may be good reasons to do this at times. However, before conducting new assessments when the information is already available, teams should ask these questions. Is the information still current? Did the information come from a reliable source, such as another certified or licensed professional? If the answer is yes to these questions, teams should then ask, why would we need additional assessments or different information? New assessments in these cases may not be necessary. Here's an example. Kelly's parents provided the school team with a report from her private SLP that includes the results of a Self-4 from just over a year ago. The results indicate that she has a language impairment. The referral concerns raised by the team are related to her reading comprehension and written language skills. The team decides to administer Self 4, Woodcock-Johnson 4 academic achievement, reading comprehension, and written language clusters only, and a classroom observation. The team does need to gather information about Kelly's academic achievement in reading comprehension and written language, and the classroom observation would provide the team with necessary information about how the concerns are impacting her in the classroom. However, administering the Self 4 again may be unnecessary. As a team, it's important to remember to focus assessments on providing relevant and necessary evidence for teams to analyze regarding the student's strengths and needs. Assessments should also provide information sufficient for establishing eligibility or ineligibility, and provide meaningful and actionable data for parents and teachers. By keeping our assessments focused, we save ourselves valuable time. Hi, I'm Julie Mead, Director of Idaho SESTA.
All right. Now,
Here at Boise State
Whoops.
University and Certified School Psychologist.
Again, this is why we practice, and in theory, this should go right back to where I need to go, and apparently it is not. So bear with me one moment, please. All right, there we go. Okay, so again, following that guidance, there may be times where it may be necessary to give that entire battery, especially like if you're suspecting that the child may have an intellectual disability, and you're wanting to see the overall global functioning of the child, and you don't have a good handle on existing data in those areas, that may be totally appropriate. But for instances where we have a lot of existing data, or we're just suspecting certain areas of concerns brought forth in the referral and the RED process, then we really have to think twice about what we need to be giving as far as assessments. All right. So now that we've selected the right tools, now we have to really look and dive in a little bit deeper and look at who are our qualified assessment users. I think the biggest takeaway on this particular principle is to really understand, again, I mentioned this earlier, but it bears repeating, that DESE does not set these qualifications about who can use the particular and specific assessments. The qualifications required to give specific assessments are set forth and developed by the test publishing companies themselves. And that's based upon the professional guidance from APA and the National School Psychologists. And those sort of professional organizations help these test publishing companies come up with these standards about who can be considered qualified to give those particular assessments. Again, DESE just will refer back to maintaining integrity with what the manual says about who can give these particular assessments. So if you call us and you ask us, well, does DESE say I can give the Woodcock, or does DESE say I can give the IQ test? We will say that you need to refer back to your publisher's guidance and follow their recommendations, because that is how the test has been normed, that is how the test has been designed, and that is how it adheres to the integrity of the particular assessment. And so those qualified users have to just demonstrate that appropriate education and experience using tests and measurements. If you remember going back to what IDEA requirements for evaluation, the one bullet on the requirement for evaluation states the assessments must be administered by trained and knowledgeable professionals. And how we determine if you're trained and knowledgeable is if you adhere to the qualification standards set forth by the publishers. And if you have staff who are giving particular assessments who are not considered an appropriate user per the publisher's guidelines, then we need to figure out, one, what training and what education would those staff members need to become a qualified user, or two, who else should we be having give that particular assessment? Because if you're not trained and you don't meet the qualifications set forth by the test publisher, then you should not be giving those particular assessments. This is just a screenshot of Pearson's qualification policies. As you can see, Pearson refers to test user as a qualified user. And I think it's important to know, to pick apart a couple of interesting things that they have here in this definition, that they say the qualified user is the person who assumes responsibilities of all aspects of the testing using this particular tool. And that includes the administration, that includes the scoring, the interpretation, and the appropriate application of the results. And so if you're not well versed in each one of those areas for the tools that you're giving, you need to really look into what the manual says about what qualifications you need to be able to meet those particular standards. And there is a caveat that Pearson puts in for some of their tests. Some of their tests that they have out there say that you may not need all of the training to be considered a qualified user in order to administer or score some of their particular test, but you have to be underneath that direct supervision of that qualified user. And the specific tests are going to be listed on their website, and it's going to say that in the manual about which specific tests may fall underneath this caveat here. So again, getting back into that manual, and this is clearly listed on each one of the test publishers' website about the training requirements that you would need to give the specific tools. This is another just kind of a snapshot here. When the testing published companies, they put forth their qualification levels, like Pearson and Riverside, they both kind of use a leveled or a tiered qualification system about who can give the certain assessments. Pearson refers to their qualifications that you can either be meet qualification A, qualification level B, or qualification level C. Riverside Insights, who publishes the Woodcock, talks about high, medium, and low qualification levels. Whatever the terminology is, it's basically the same. So for those qualification B level tests, in order to be considered a qualified user on those types of tests, you usually have to have a master's or some kind of formal training on assessments and interpretation training on that. And those types of level B or those medium level qualification required tests are usually like your achievement test or your Vineland or your BASC rating scales, those kinds of assessments. However, when you move up level, and like I said, Pearson calls it a level C qualification, typically the training requirements and the education requirements and the practicum requirements necessary to be considered an appropriately certified user of that particular assessment, like your cognitive assessments listed here, those will increase with the complexity of the test. So we have to make sure that we're adhering to those qualification standards. I didn't put qualification A on here because qualification A, there really aren't a lot of those particular tests out there. They require very little training, if minimal training on there. A lot of those were like your criterion referenced inventories or screener tools like that. So the takeaway here is to go back and look at your particular test manuals and your particular test websites, and to make sure that whoever you're having use these particular assessments meet the qualification standards set forth by the test publishing company. All right, so we've been talking about getting into that manual a lot, and this is something that appears both in the Wyatt manual and the Woodcock-Johnson manual. They talk about that there's a difference in level of qualifications necessary for folks who administer and score the assessments, rather than for the individuals that we are using to interpret the scores of the particular tests and assessments here. So you can see this is taken directly from those test manuals, and that their guidance out there is that we have to have individuals who possess a higher level of training when we're looking at who can interpret those scores. So again, going back and digging into what your test manuals say about the qualifications about who can give the assessment and who can interpret those scores. Kind of some key things to think about here when we're making sure that our staff are appropriately trained. What kind of evidence or what kind of documentation do we have to show that our staff are appropriately trained on giving and scoring and interpreting those tests, those specific tests? Staff should really keep proof of training. This was something that was mentioned to me from legal counsel years ago, and I just kind of keep this in my back pocket because it makes a lot of sense. If your evaluations are ever called into question, or if you ever have to defend your particular test and assessment practices in a due process or a legal proceeding, or even if we have to defend the accuracy of our results to parents or advocates who may be questioning, one of the things that they may be asking us for is how are you trained? What are your credentials for training on this particular instrument here? And so if you keep log or keep proof of your different training opportunities that you've had on the particular assessments that you're giving, then you would have that documentation. And again, there's a wide range of training activities that could suffice for these qualification levels. Some of them will be very specific to your particular test, so you need to look at your test manual for that information. But a lot of them have training webinars and free test interpretation resources on their websites. Pearson and Riverside Insights both have webinars about interpretation, and also your professional organizations and your RPDCs and your LACE groups can hold some of those trainings as well as looking at doing like a self-study, doing a manual review, having your different psychometric examiners or your diagnostic staff sitting around with the different manual and actually going through and highlighting different parts of the manual and having a self-study or a book study on the manual is also an appropriate training activity. So when we're looking at being familiar with the tools themselves, one of the guiding principles set forth by the Code of Testing Practices and also put forth by the APA and looking at their standards for practice when we're looking at adhering to the integrity of the different tests and measurements that are out there, we have to have working background knowledge about the technical aspects of the particular test. We have to make sure that we're using tests that are reliable measures, and we have to make sure that they're valid measures of what we're actually trying to measure, and making sure that the tests that we purchase and the tests that we utilize within our evaluations have a small margin of error. We know that every testing situation, there are inherent errors that happen within the testing situation. No test is 100% free of errors. But when we're looking at the calculation of an error, standard error of measurement, we want to make sure that that's small, so that we can say that we are actually giving a very reliable assessment, and that the results can be replicated with accuracy. And then also with the technical aspects, we want to make sure that we're using the appropriate normative samples. And we're going to be looking at that in a little bit more detail later on, but making sure that we actually know what kind of samples, what kind of population that particular test was normed on. Because if we're wanting to use an assessment on a population that the test wasn't designed for or wasn't normed with, then there could be some inherent questions about the reliability and the validity of that particular test. So where can you find all of this information? You can really dig deep. If you have some nights that you're really having trouble sleeping, you can dig out your technical manuals with each one of these assessments there. And the technical manuals are much more in depth, and they'll describe like the reliability coefficients and the validity coefficients of the particular test. So you can dig into those technical manuals that come with every one of your tests and assessments. On the test websites themselves, the publisher websites, they'll provide links to that sort of information. There is an organization out there, the Burroughs Center for Testing, that does online test reviews. It's kind of like a consumer reports of the different psychometric tests that are out there. And so those are for pay. So just be cautious about that, that if you want to review a test through their company, you would have to pay for that. But that might be something worthwhile if you're really having questions about selecting different tools, if you're looking to purchase them and so on and so forth. Or contacting some of your professional organizations. They may have test reviews that you can use to help make your purchasing and tool selection a little bit easier on that as well. So also when we're talking about the technical aspects of an assessment, beyond just is it a valid measure, is it a reliable measure, we really have to kind of dig in deep and making sure that we're selecting the right tool for the job. And what that entails is we have to make sure that we understand what exactly is the purpose and the scope of the assessment that we're choosing to use for that particular a determination that we're wanting to collect data for. And inside each one of your test manuals, one of the very first pages that it will tell you is the scope and purpose of that particular assessment. And it's very important to make sure that we're not using a test for a purpose or outside of the scope of the intended use of that test. For instance, sometimes we'll see brief measures of a cognitive test like the K-BIT being used. And when you look into the manual, it will tell you that it's to be used as a screener and not to be used for eligibility determinations. However, sometimes we'll see those in evaluation reports where they maybe use a brief intelligence test total score to qualify for ID or eligibility for SLD. So we have to be very careful about going in there and looking at the purpose of that particular tool and making sure that we're not using it for a purpose that it's not intended to do. And the same thing with a brief versus a comprehensive test of achievement. Some of those you can use for screeners. Some of them are just, you can't use the screeners for a comprehensive test of achievement. Again, that's all laid out in those test manuals to knowing the purpose and the scope of that assessment. And with the scope and the purpose, we also have to understand the limitations of each assessment. Every assessment has different limitations. And again, going back to that purpose of why that test was designed for. And in order to get a valid, sound evaluation, one that you can defend, one that you can say with reliability that is actually making those eligibility determinations appropriately and making sound decisions about educational decisions for the kid, we have to be able to understand exactly what the limits are of the tools that we're choosing. Again, going back and having those conversations about, is this a valid measure? Does it actually measure what it's intended to? And is it a reliable measure? And how those constructs are measured on a test. A lot of times we'll have conversations with assessment staff who they'll say that on the Woodcock-Johnson, it may score really, really high on written expression, or on the Wyatt, it may score really, really low in the area of numerical operations. What we have to understand is sometimes those different subtests, even though they may be named the same on different test batteries, they may measure the constructs in different ways, or they may measure the constructs in a less demanding, task demanding way. So we have to be really fluent and well-versed on how those particular tests are measuring those constructs. Item density is huge. So when we're looking at in the manuals, it will tell us how many items are on each subtest, and then it will break down what skills those particular items measure. So when you open up the Wyatt manual, it will tell you, like in the area of math calculations under numerical operations there, it will tell you that out of the 45 questions on that test, only 2 address long division, only 2 address 2-digit addition, and only 1 address 3-digit subtraction. So when we look at the item density, that goes back to looking at, is there enough items on that particular test or subtest to make a decision about a kid's current functioning on a particular skill? So making sure that we understand that. And for some of our little learners, especially those students who may be just right on the verge of the appropriate age for some of these assessments, like some of these achievement assessments go down to 5 years old, or some of them will even go down to 4-year-old. When you have really young learners who may be young and low learners, there may not be a sufficient floor of items there to really get a good feel of where the kid is actually performing in comparison to their norm group. For example, on some of the subtests there, we all know that you may have a kid who could score a raw score of 0, may not get any of the items correctly, but their standard score may still come out like an S75 to an 88. Or it was one on the score chart of the Wyatt there on one of the raw scores, that if you got a score of 0 for your little learners, that may still show up as an average score. So we have to be very cautious about when we're interpreting those scores for our young learners and for our older learners as well. Norm stratification. That's just a fancy term used to making sure that we understand what population this test was normed over. Did it include your special populations? Did it include maybe students with specific learning disabilities? Did it include students with hearing impairments or visual impairments within that normative sample? Because that's going to be really important to making sure that the tool that we use is going to have the validity and the research behind it to say that it can actually measure those constructs within those special populations. And the same thing with diverse cultural groups. And making sure that to note the date that that assessment was normed and the date that it was published, because there's this there's a philosophy out there, not really philosophy, there's a guiding principle in psychology called the Flynn effect. And what that means, especially in the world of cognitive batteries, is that that has looked at the IQ of our society and of our population over the past years, since like the 1930s. And what it's found is that every year our society changes and we get more technologically advanced, and our society increases their knowledge as a whole. So that's going to increase our IQ supposedly on these particular tests. So we have to make sure that we're using cognitive batteries that have updated norms to account for this Flynn effect. So that leads us to a question that we get a lot. We always have the question that whenever test publishers release a new edition, just like the Wyatt 4 just recently came out, what are the guidelines to switching over to that newest edition? And again, DESE doesn't set these guidelines. We say you need to adhere to the publishing company's guidelines. And the publishing companies for some time were really kind of hesitant to put out some black and white guidance, because they were really hesitant, thinking that the general public might think that they were just trying to sell their new assessment or sell their new test. So really what they did is they reached out to some of the professional organizations like the National Council on Test and Measurements and the Code of Fair Testing Practices, the Joint Committee, and they looked at what do the statistics say about the obsoleteness and the validity of the norms of the population whenever we have new assessments. And that's where they really drew their guidance here. And so you can say Pearson has released a document that really kind of answers that question about in order to keep reliability and validity on their test and assessment products, that really what they recommend, and it's not really what they recommend, is the community shared standard of practice within the professional organizations, that within a year of a newly released edition or a version of a test, that's when teams should really start switching over from the old versions to the new versions. Okay. And again, things change over time. Over the last few years, the way literacy has been measured by our different norm reference tests has changed. If any of you all are using the Wyatt 4, you'll know what I mean. There was a drastic difference between the Wyatt 3 and the Wyatt 4 on the way that it really breaks down the specific skills necessary to really get in and measure all components of effective literacy and literacy knowledge. And so over time, research has shown us that there's different and better ways to measure constructs of learning. And so that's why test publishers are always evolving with the ways that they measure different constructs. And so that's why it's important to really understand how your particular test measures those constructs. I think over the last couple of years that I've been looking into this has really been an eye-opener for me. This is one of those things that I wish I really had a better grasp upon whenever I was looking at the tests and assessments there and aligning those to making educational decisions and developing IEP goals and making eligibility determinations on test and assessment results, is looking at how those items are laid out in a test. What are the complexity of those items? So when we're looking at measuring reading in your Wyatt or your Woodcock, what is the lowest level of complexity for a reading task? Usually it's letter word identification, where they have to identify letters. And then that task goes up in complexity all the way to passage comprehension. So knowing where those lines are on your different tests and subtests about the different levels of complexity of the task will really help you do an error analysis a little bit better of where the kid may be bottoming out with their skills, and where we can come in with some instructional implications or interventions to really help those kids. So dig into your manuals, find this text complexity, find the task demand charts, because that will tell you what the kid needs to be able to do in order to get an accurate answer on that measure. And so I'll take a look at those here in just a second. And when you can start drawing some similarities and discrepancies between how the kids' cognitive processes may vary on their performance on the different measures, then you can start developing some hypotheses about maybe the strengths and weaknesses of this child and where are some deficits in the psychological processing. So just remembering what those different constructs are and how they're measured on those particular tests. Here is just a screenshot of what's called a task demand chart, and this can be found in your Woodcock-Johnson Achievement Technical Manual. Actually, your Woodcock-Johnson Technical Manual has these task demand charts for the cognitive battery, the oral language battery, and for the achievement, because all three of those assessments are co-normed. And so there's great overlap, and you can make a lot of comparison and analysis between the three components of that. But anyway, when you're looking here, it will tell you the particular subtask. So like on letter word identification, it will tell you which particular cognitive ability you're looking at and how the student was given that information. For this particular subtest, the kid had to take in visual information. What was that task requirement? What was the kid supposed to be able to do with that information? How was the kid's brain supposed to cognitively work with that information in order to give you an accurate answer? So looking at all of that and comparing the different cognitive processes and the task demands throughout the different assessments that you give will really help you make some in-depth analysis about the kid's learning profile and the particular strengths and weaknesses of the kid. And then that was of the Woodcock-Johnson. The KTEA manual here, it has it in a little bit a simplified version here. They prescribe to the input, process, output. methodology, and it's really the same, but it's just kind of captured within 3 columns there instead of more specifically defined as the Woodcock-Johnson does. But again, same kind of analysis that you could do here. In the subtest where the kid was asked to take in information auditorily, the kid started to bomb those particular subtests. And whenever the student was asked to retrieve information from their long-term working memory or their short-term working memory, the kids struggled with that. So you can start to make some comparisons. And again, for the educational programming piece of it, this will really help you fine-tune your recommendations for programming and educational needs of the kid. So just making sure that you truly understand the intent. Dr. Schultz is a professor that is associated with Woodcock-Johnson, and he's done a lot of research in identifying and assessing students for SLD. And when we're having conversations, if you guys were part of the Woodcock-Johnson training that I hosted from our RHPDC, you know that whenever we're looking at achievement results, we really are looking at 2 things. We're looking at academic skills, but we're also looking at that cognitive process. Does the kid have the cognitive process intact and able to use that in order to perform these academic skills? And that was kind of on those task demand charts that we were just looking at. And so when you get into your manual, the Wyatt and the KTEA will clearly show you that how to use this information to determine out which cognitive processing the kid may be deficit in, and that may be impacting their academic skill acquisition. The important thing to remember about norm reference achievement tests, they do not tell you the mastery or progress towards curriculum or state standard. I think that's the biggest thing to take away with, because a lot of times in our eligibility determination meetings, we'll be sharing the standard scores that may come up near average or above average. And we may have teachers and we may even have parents say, well, how can that be? Because in the classroom, he can't perform this. He can't adhere to our curriculum. He can't master our grade level standards or our course level standards. And that's because we're not using that. The achievement data on those norm reference achievement tests aren't supposed to tell us that. That's not the intended purpose. The intended purpose of that particular score is to show us where the child performed in comparison to a normed group population. So just keep in mind that we're not looking at achievement mastery of curriculum or standards with these achievement batteries. Okay. And then whenever we're doing administration, the next principle that we're looking at is to how to actually administer the tests themselves. So when we're looking at administering the test, it's very, very critical that we adhere to the standardized testing procedures in order to maintain the validity and the integrity of those test results. So inside, again, you guys are going to get sick of me saying the whole manual thing, but it's really, really critical that we get into those manuals and find out what those standardized procedures are. And I know sometimes we give these tests so many times over and over and over that it's sometimes easy to see that we're kind of going off the standardized procedure of administering that test without even recognizing it. So we really need to get in there and be mindful that we're adhering to all of those standardized procedures relating to the administration and scoring of a particular assessment, because the standardization of the test allows us to say, yep, we've got a valid and reliable measurement here of the kids' processing of the kids' academic skills, of the kids' behavior. So getting into the manual and looking at all of the procedures that relate to where you start, where you end with the different items, how you address the practice items. Can you prompt the kid for additional information? Can you clarify their responses? What are the time limits? Some of your assessments have timed sections on there. And if the time section is 90 seconds, you really can't give them 120 or 150 because that would be in non-congruence with the standardization procedure there. What materials do you need? Are you using Q Interactive or Q Global where you need iPads for you or you and the student? So making sure that you understand what materials you may need, what manipulatives you might need, and have those all there and ready for you when you're doing your administration. And making sure that we're doing it in the order, if your assessment requires you to do subtests in a specific order, making sure that we're adhering to that, because that all feeds into the way the tests are calculated and how the test was normed. And if we go off of that, if we go off those standardized administration procedures, we have to make sure that every stakeholder who reads that evaluation report is aware that those results from that particular test or assessment were performed under non-standardized procedures or non-standardized administration. And we have to really proceed with caution, because a lot of times when we go off the standardized procedure to administer that test, that will render our results invalid or not reliable. So just be sensitive to that. Also, when you're administering assessments to kiddos, just be sensitive to whenever you're pulling kids out for testing sessions. I've had conversations in the past where we've looked at the students' scores and they scored very poorly, or they got a very low rating on particular assessment tools. And then we start talking and we find out that the kid was pulled for assessments during a fun Friday or during school carnival or during movie time. And really, we have to be cognizant. I know our time is limited and our time, we have lots of things in our schedule, but we really have to make sure that we're setting up the best environment for that kid to make sure that we have the most optimal testing time, testing environment, to show for the kid to show really what they have as far as knowledge and skills and cognitive processes. So that involves building that rapport and relationship to the kid with the kids as well. And one thing that I think is overlooked a lot of times during the testing session is to make sure that when you're giving these tests and assessments to students, that you're conducting behavioral observations during these testing sessions, because that behavioral observation can really help put those context of the scores that you receive off that test into a broader context. How did the kid master those problems? If the kid came to a problem that he was struggling with, what strategy did the kid use to figure out that problem? Math, did they write it on scratch paper if they're allowed to do that? Did they count on their fingers? Did they use some other strategy to figure it out? What strategy did they use to decode unknown words? All of that information can help teams whenever they're determining which particular educational programming decisions might be appropriate for this kiddo, and determining strengths and weaknesses for the kid as well. All right, and again, when we're looking at scoring, just making sure that when you're scoring an assessment, to be very familiar with those basal and ceiling rules. Riverside Publishing has a really good free webinar on their clinical resources page, the website, and we have that linked in our resource guide here, that deals with reviewing those basal and ceiling rules, because it's really important that we start at the right place for our kids on the assessment and we end at the right place, and making sure that we give all allowable responses and all the credit that we can to the kids, or that will really kind of overinflate or underestimate the kids' scores on some of those tests. Make sure that you're double checking those raw scores. I know a lot of us have transitioned to electronic scoring or electronic administration of assessments, but still just be wary of that, because it still relies upon data input from the administrator. So, it's really easy to put in a 5 instead of a 7 or something like that. A slip of a finger can make a big difference on the number that you put in for a raw score that can have a really big impact on the scoring. So again, if you get some of those outlier scores, like Jeannie had mentioned earlier, if you get some scores that are really, really low and it's not really an expected score for the particular student, go back and question that. And if you can't figure out why the maybe discrepancy in that score, why that came out maybe lower or higher than you expected, call the test publishing company. They all have testing representative and testing specialists that will work with you to figure out different scenarios about why you may have received a different score than you were expecting. Particularly on behavioral rating scales, we know that behavior and different social and emotional skills, they develop over time. They don't have equal intervals of development. So a raw score that a kid may have received on a behavior rating scale when they were 7 may have a totally different impact and a totally different score than when the kid is 12 or 13 years old. And being able to understand that difference in those scores and being able to explain that to all the stakeholders and who are looking at the evaluation report is really important. So if you don't know, I would highly suggest researching it in the manual or reaching out to the test publisher to get some insight about that. And making sure, again, on the interpretation, making sure that we understand how we can interpret all of those test results. There's actually kind of 2 levels that we can interpret test results. One, we can interpret it within the test battery itself, making comparison on the subtest, making comparison with the domain scores or the different scales that are available within the context of that particular tool. But then also, because the norm reference tests are based upon standard units of measure or standard scores, we can use cross-assessment comparisons. So that's when we can look at what cognitive processes and what academic skills did the kid need in order to do to make a good score on the Wyatt versus what the kid needed to do an appropriate score on the Basque or the adaptive behavior skills. There are some overlaps on those skills. And so making sure that we know that we can compare those particular batteries or those tests across different instruments is really helpful for that data analysis piece. But always go back to that manual and follow the interpretation guidance, because in the Woodcock and the KTEA and the ABAS and the Vineland, it will give you some interpretation cautions. So it will tell you that if you received this score, or if you receive an index score that shows that there are a lot of negative responses, to interpret that with caution. So go back and really look at those manuals, and don't always rely upon those computer generated score reports to tell you this information, because I've seen some really good computer generated score reports that give you all of this background information, and I've seen some that really don't. So it's very imperative that you know what those scoring interpretations and those cautions might be by going back into the manual there. Very quickly, I know we're running short on time here, but just to kind of give you a brief a brief overview of some of the scores that you may receive when you're looking at those norm reference tests. It's really important to remember, again, norm reference tests are comparing the individual student's results in comparison to a normed group or a normed population. And so it's that comparison there. So those norm reference results are going to be showing the rank order or the comparison or the position of that student's score in comparison to the normed population that took that particular assessment. So again, remembering that they're not going to show us mastery of certain criteria or mastery of certain standards. They're going to show us ranking or position of their responses, of their performance in relationship to a normed population. And with this relative standing, we understand too that these norm reference test scores fall upon a normal distribution, or their naturally occurring distribution of scores. And so for those of us who have taken stats class, this should look very, very familiar, and it may bring back some shudders to you with all those different calculations that we had to learn to do with the bell-shaped curve here. But the important part to remember about a normally normed distribution of scores is that when we're looking at this, we can compare lots of different types of standard scores using this particular graphic here. And we know that on a normal distribution, that the majority of our scores are going to fall right there at that mean of that assessment. And then whenever we find scores that deviate further away from the mean of that assessment, those are ones that should come on our radar. Those are ones that maybe have clinical significance or maybe unusual that we need to take note of. One of my mentors years ago gave me the idea, excuse me, of taking this particular graphic into eligibility meetings and actually using this graphic to explain to parents and other stakeholders how the students' performance on different measurements that they were using within the evaluation report fell in relationship to their performance and the performance of the norm population. And so I remember that a lot of times we would take this graphic and plot on there specifically where the students' achievement scores were falling on the bell curve, where the students' cognitive scores were, where the adaptive scores were. And we would look to see if there were strengths and weaknesses in the profile. And we would also look to see how tightly the scores were clustered around one area or the other, or how wide of a variance was. And that was able to give us a lot of conversations about data analysis and the learning profiles of the student. So just a little helpful to, and anytime that we can put scores into a visual representation, it's always a little bit easier for folks who aren't as well versed in stats to help understand that. Really quickly too, when we're looking at score reports, one of the main scores that are reported on norm reference tests are what's called a standard score. And that's basically like your basic score that you can receive from a test or an assessment. And all that is that's the student's raw score that's converted into a standard unit of measurement. So we can compare those scores with other scores that we receive within the same testing tool or other norm reference tools. And those are typically the scores that you find with the index scores, composite scores, the cluster scores. Those are typically those types of scores that are the standard scores. And we know from looking back at our bell-shaped curve that the majority of our norm reference tests have that mean of 100 with that standard deviation of 15 points. But I caution you to always look at your manual, because there are some speech and language tests out there, and there are some other assessments that may have a different standard deviation. Most of them nowadays have 15, but there used to be some tests that had a standard deviation of 14 or 16. So just be cautious of that. Another score that we typically find on score reports that sometimes can be a little bit misleading is the understanding of percentile ranking, and making sure that we don't inaccurately think that if a kid received a score of 75th percentile, that means that they got 75% of the answers correct. That's totally inaccurate and a misinterpretation. For the example here that we have below, say you were testing a 12-year-old student, and on a 12-year-old student, they earned a percentile rank of 75th percentile, or they earned a score that whenever you converted it to a percentile rank, came out to be the 75th percentile rank on a test of oral language. What that really means is on that particular test of oral language, that particular student did better than 75% of the other 12-year-olds in that norm group that took that same test of oral language. And so making sure to go back and about remembering the testing rank and position of that student's performance in comparison to the norm group. Okay. All right, so here we are. So this leads to a really big question. What scores, what sample norm group do we use in comparison when we're calculating these scores? Do we use age-based norms? Do we use grade-based norms? And I can tell you that the test publishers have recently updated their guidance to kind of address some of those pandemic school closure aspects. But when you go back and you review some of the older test manuals, like I was reviewing a Wyatt 3 and a Woodcock 3 manual here just recently, and when we go back and we actually look in those manuals from previous editions of tests, they've been fairly consistent about their guidance about when to use age and when to use grade-based scores. So it's really important to get in there and figure out when we use that, and to make those justifying, maybe some of those clinical expertise judgments about there may be a time when we can run both sets of scores and see which one's the most appropriate based upon the student characteristics. So let's get into that just a little bit. So when we're looking at running test scores, and this is typically for your achievement tests, some language tests, that they will give you two sets of norms to look at. Age-based norms when you're comparing them to other peers of their same age, or grade-based peers when you're comparing them of the same grade. And so when we're looking at that, Pearson and Riverside Insights have both come up with different, actually they're the same guidance, they just use their different test names, but they put it in chart format about different scenarios when you should be using grade-based, when you should be using age-based, and when maybe you should use both sets of norms to compare your student scores, and then the clinical judgment and the clinical conversations that need to take place on when to use those particular sets of norms. One that I want to focus on very quickly, I know our time's running short here, but one I want to really focus on, it really hones in on students that we suspect having SLD. And when we're doing an evaluation for a student that, oh, we might be going down the SLD route, and that we're looking at using the discrepancy model. So in the discrepancy model, you know, we compare academic achievement with cognitive ability. So in those sort of situations, both Pearson and Riverside Insights, you can look back on their guidance here, really state that teams need to use age-based norms when we're making those types of comparisons between achievement and cognitive ability, because both of those scoring assessments should be used on age-based norms, so we can use the same sort of reference group to have those conversations and to make those comparisons. So this may be something that you may want to go back and look at your current policies and practices right now. If we're suspecting SLD on a student, how are we running those, and what norms are we using? Are we using age-based or grade-based? And does that align with what the publishers are telling us, that really we should use age-based when we're suspecting SLD and making those ability versus cognitive ability comparisons? Okay. And just making sure that ethically, if we're just making sure that we know why we're choosing the norm group that we are, and that we're not trying to cherry pick a particular assessment result because it's higher or lower that would meet the different eligibility criteria, that we have justification and the test publisher's guidance to back us on why we're picking that. And to kind of close this all out, whenever we're looking at developing an evaluation report, making sure that we're reporting all of those levels of scores obtained, because just putting a full scale score, IQ score in the evaluation report doesn't really tell us much if we don't know those index scores or those subtest scores that related to that particular IQ score. And so making sure, again, to include those charts and graphs that come with the score interpretation, as well as those narratives. and making sure that you're familiar with what resources and what kind of score reports your tools can actually provide you. For so long, we've just kind of gotten into the habit of just looking at those score reports for just a number, either a qualifying number or some sort of number that we need for eligibility determination. When really, if we expand our use of those and use them as their intended purpose, we'll see that rating scales such as the Vineland or the BASC actually have built-in reports that can help us kind of beef up the reliability and validity of those scores, because sometimes raters tend to either overly estimate a student's skills and give them overly positive ratings, or sometimes they look for overly negative skills on there. And so both the BASC and the Vineland can run those index scores and look for what the BASC calls an F index, looking at the negative distortion of the rating. So this may help you really kind of look at, are those ratings on those scales reliable and valid measures? And also the KTEA and WIAT, they allow you to do error pattern analysis. And then that really helps you break down what skills was the kid able to do on a particular assessment, and what skills did they struggle at. And then you can use that with the task demand charts about maybe what cognitive processes were used in that ability area. And then it will also give you corresponding goal suggestions. So even if the kid doesn't meet eligibility and doesn't have an IEP developed, you can still use those particular goal suggestions for help with intervention and instruction. So those are some resources out there that, again, digging into those manuals that come with the different tests and tools can really be helpful. So our action steps, and it's hard to believe that I can't believe that I ended just right at 10:30 here. So some of our action steps here, just reviewing your processes that you're currently reviewing. If you have questions, reach out to us. We'll be more than happy to check the versions of the tests that you're using. You really don't want to be using a behavior rating scale that was developed in 1984 and discontinued in 1989, but you're still using photocopies of it. So making sure that, and reviewing those training levels of all your staff, and then looking at ahead about what training you might need. And speaking of training, real quick, some of the RPDC, I am offering different virtual trainings on the different tools. And so in this PowerPoint here is hyperlinked to the particular training registration. If you need training on those particular tools, reach out to me. There are the dates. These are both going to be virtual. I have my contact information there. And then some up training ones that I'm scheduling are listed here on this page, so stay tuned. The last one, really quick, I want to draw your attention to, in order for us to really understand what our tests and measurements are measuring, the constructs of learning, we have to really be able to understand how learning takes place in a normal learner in order to be able to really make educational decisions and maybe make score interpretations for instances where the learning may not be normal progression. So understanding the learning demands and learning progressions, we're going to have a 3-day institute on that coming up this year in my particular RPDC. And stay tuned, because I know our other RPDCs may jump on board and offer some trainings, and we'll get that information out to you. With that, we just ask you to, we'll stay open for questions, but if you have a minute, if you could fill out this survey for us to give us a little bit more insight, what training might you need? What training might your staff need? And how can the RPDCs and DESE support you in your continued learning about tests and assessments? And I know that was a lot of information, very quick overview there. Please process all of that. If you have questions, I know, Bev, are you okay to stay on the line for a little bit more? We'll leave the chat open. You can ask us the questions, and then Jeannie and I will develop a question and answer document after that to address your questions. Or you can email us questions. And it's funny because my email just popped on and I have like 3 or 4 of you guys who've already emailed me questions. That's awesome. Send it our way and we'll continue this learning. So we'll just leave it open now for the chat.
Yes, I'll leave it open at least 5 more minutes or maybe longer. And thank you everybody for joining us today. And thanks Jeannie and Tiffany.
You're welcome. And yes, thank you for the 132 people that I see held on with us. We know that this went over a little bit of time, but it was really challenging to kind of break this down. So we appreciate you guys hanging on with us. Again, reach out and let us know how we can support you, or if you have any questions.